up in Detroit, I always took auto history kind of for granted. And I worked for Wayne County Parks and Wayne County Road Commission, got laid off in 1983. And my dream was to get my graduate degree to Kyoto Institute in Japan. So I went to Japan when I was laid off in 1983 and lived with a family who was working on the Walt Disney project and center there in Tokyo. And wherever I went in Japan and the people found out I was from Detroit, they would get all animated. They would start asking me questions about automobiles and did I own an automobile, did I make an automobile, and I started to realize that the automobile had a worldwide impact, but being from Detroit, I just kind of took it for granted. And when I came back and started working for Wayne County again, of course the first thing they asked me to do was to tear down the original village industry plants. So instead of tearing them down, I started historically registering them, much to the dismay of my supervisor at the time. And I met a man called Don Whirling, who was executive director of the Ford Fairlane estate there in Dearborn. And he started talking to me. He says, Nancy, I applaud your effort to historically register these plants, but until you tell the story, nobody really understands the significance. All of these village industry plants are abandoned right now, so what are you doing? So we came up with this concept of developing a heritage trail. And then Don came back to me, and after we laid out this heritage trail following all the village industry plants on the Huron River, the Rouge River, and the Clinton River, he said, you know what we really should be doing is establishing a national heritage area, an auto national heritage area, and we should be petitioning Congress and to see if we could get established through the National Park Service. So thus became the idea, really mostly from Don Whirling, was to establish this national heritage area. Now, I was just kind of bargaining for doing this heritage trail, self-guided tourism trail, of going to visit these village industry plants, and I was just trying to save the village industry plants. But once Don started educating me about the significance of these auto sites, he took me on this car ride and we looked at the Ford Piquette plant. Would I ever dream that I was going to be the executive director here? No. But it was slated for demolition, and almost every place he took me was slated for demolition. Highland Park, a Packard plant, you name it, Dodge Main. And he said, we got to do something about this. So we started this about 1983. I would say we really started getting serious about trying to organize a group of community leaders to start a legislative effort in the late 80s. Thankfully, Dingle was open to our ideas, and Connie Shorter, who was his executive legislative aide at that time, she finally started helping us organize meetings about pulling a coalition together to establish the Automobile National Heritage Area, of which later on would be changed to MotorCities National Heritage Area. Dingle pulled together a coalition of Republicans and Democrats to support our efforts. But in the early days, Don and I would do these presentations to every city that would be involved with these auto heritage sites. So I personally did 75 presentations in a year and a half. I was unmarried at the time, so I think Don was kind of tied down being the director of Fairlane. But I would say, I gotta be honest with you, not everybody had open arms to this idea, because I actually had my job threatened. I had to use my own vacation and sick time to make these presentations. But when I went to the cities, I started with the village industry plant, and I went to Milan and Manchester and Dundee and Monroe and all of those. You could see in their eyes, like they would say, what? This is significant? This is important? This happened here? And their whole mindset would change after you talk to it. But one of my favorite stories to tell about. Was actually a painful experience I had with Plymouth Township. They have one of the village industry plants, Wilcox Mill, in their area, and Phoenix, which was the first plant that Henry Ford built for women only. And eventually, those women were moved to Willow Run and became the original Rosa Riveters. So I was on the agenda for Plymouth Township, and Maury Breen, I believe, was the supervisor. Then he put me last on the agenda, and the agenda was full of a lot of controversial things. Let's just say, and being a single mom, I had my daughter with me, and I was holding her through this whole meeting. So finally, I came up on the agenda. It was almost midnight. That's how long I sat there. And it's only me. My daughter had fallen asleep, curled up like a little kitten in the chair next to me. And there was these two older women that were just dressed so elegantly, had gloves on and straw hats. They looked beautiful. And these older women, and I did my big song and dance about why it's so important that we historically register these plants, and we want to do this self-guided tourism trail and everything. And Maury looked over at the one woman. He says, do you support this? And she just went like this, very quietly like this. He says, approved. They all unanimously approved it. And they got up and walked out of the room, and I'm looking at this woman, and she just smiled at me. And later I was to find out that that was Margaret Dunning, who had donated, ended up donating millions of dollars to Plymouth Township and the city of Plymouth for both their library and their history museum. So I just remember that was a lesson to me, that it's really about who you network with and who you inspire and who's going to champion your cause. And we had to do that over and over and over again. But one of the champions that I can't say enough about was Barbara Nelson Jameson from the Rivers and Trails program. I had called her up, and Paul Lovowitz. They were working for Cuyahoga National Park at the time, and I told them that I wanted to start this trail of all the village industry plants. Paul had shown up to meet with us, and I'm so moved because he came all the way up from Ohio, met with us. I drove him to all these village industries, and he came back, and Barbara came down and met with us, and they supported us. Our own communities weren't supporting us, but here's these people from National Park saying, you have one of the most significant stories in America to tell. It can only be told here, and you should go for it. And without them, I don't think we would have ever had the guts to knock on all these congressmen's doors and do that. That was really an eye-waking experience of how, no matter how many times people think it's a dumb idea, you have to believe that it will make ripple effects that will forever change your community, and we just went and we did it. The thing that really also was instilled the belief in me is Connie Shorter pulled a group together, and we sat in this little kitchenette area in Congressman Dingell's office, and we actually drafted some legislation. And I thought, wow, I'm drafting legislation. I can't even spell my name barely. And it was an eye-awakening on how powerful America is, because it allows its people to actually define legislation. It came from the bottom up, and that was a very moving. Despite the fact that we were there all night drinking very bad coffee, it was a very moving experience for me to be part of that early effort to draft, something on paper. So what Don and I proposed to do is make this self-guided tourism trail along the river to see all the village industry plants. And when we presented it to the cities, they said, well, that building's abandoned. And we said, yeah, in fact, every building on here but one is actually abandoned. And we used to use the tagline, we're going to bring these abandoned buildings to become amazing buildings. And so we got a mini grant from the Department of Transportation. It's interesting because they were interested in promoting travel on the roads, and so they gave us a mini grant, and then Ford Land Development gave us some of the match, and Don and I put a group of people together, and we created the Red Trail, which was along the Huron River Raisin, and we put the Blue Trail around, which is around the Meadow Rouge River, that goes all the way to the Detroit River, and eventually we were going to go into Canada and do their village industry plants in Canada. Of all of these mills that we put on this self-guided tourism trail, everyone has been redeveloped but one. And I think we did some economic study, like one became the city hall, another one became a banquet and rental facility, another one became an office building. One is, they actually restored the water wheel in Northville, and it's rented out to various offices, and that's in private ownership, but he's put a tremendous amount of money in cleaning up the site and doing that, and it's just millions and millions of dollars of redevelopment happened around these. And if you think about it, it all started with us telling the stories about them and people driving from one empty building to another and then reimagining what could be here. And that's something that MotorCities National Heritage Area continues to do, is they take and redevelop these historic sites, tells their story, and create, it's almost like the butterfly effect. It comes, they cocoon it, and then out comes this beautiful butterfly and a new life and new economic activity around it. And it's just amazing. Every time we've taken a project on, just to watch. Just this building now, we're sitting in the Ford Piquette Avenue Plant, which I have the honor of being the director. And when I first saw, when Jerry Mitchell and Dick Folsom and Randy Mason showed me this building, it was an empty shell. And they told me they wanted to buy it, and it was slated for demolition. And now they've had 20,000 people here just last year. And since 2013, we've had over 92 countries come through. And every one of these people have spent money, have stayed overnight, have done other things, and actually invested in Detroit because of a result of the historic preservation that's taking place here. One of the things I'm really hoping to do in my involvement of the MotorCities National Heritage Area is to inspire the next generation. They need to know more about the significance of the contribution of this industry worldwide than they do now. They should never find themselves in a foreign country wondering why their hometown is more important to these foreigners than it is to you who grew up there. And MotorCities National Heritage Area has taken the task of actually putting the story in a way that the public can understand and inspiring the next generation from these stories to actually get out there and be the innovators of tomorrow. Once we started getting some momentum, people were joining on. Once we got that Ford Heritage Trail started, then they wanted heritage trails that told other stories, like the Flint stories, the Sloan Museum and General Motors and all that. And then they wanted to tell the Chrysler stories. But of course, at one time, there was close to 300 automobile companies in Michigan, just Michigan alone. And there's a lot of stories. Each little community has their own story and their own contribution to the progress that was made through the time of all the research and development involved in the automobile. And before we knew it, we had a lot of people. We started with the Detroit riverfront, we went to the Rouge River, then we had the Huron River Raisin, then we went up to Flint, and from there we went to Lansing. Told the Lansing story because, of course, you know, you got the world's largest manufacturing plant today, which was back then the Vermeulen. And then, of course, Jackson has a huge story regarding the automobile with the taxi cab and stuff like that. And now we're trying to build a Hackett Museum out there. So the communities came forward, and that's why the Motor Cities area became so loud. So when we started with this district here, and because this was the concentrated part of the auto story. We also did a major inventory that inventoried all the sites throughout the state of Michigan, and that was a huge project, and it was very exciting to do. But we ended up with corridors, so we had the Detroit River hub, the Flint hub, the Irish Hills Lansing, and then we had the Lower Rouge, the Middle Rouge, and then the Upper Woodward, as well as the Lower Woodward and the Ypsilanti hub. And those were the first hubs. And then we started bringing on affiliated areas, which was the Jackson group. It's still my dream that we actually look at the Canadian story, because they were greatly in partnership with us here in Detroit in terms of manufacturing in the turn of the century. 20 years ago, when Don Whirling and I started stumping across the region to chambers of commerce, to convention bureaus, to the city fathers and stuff, trying to tell them that we want to historically register these sites, we wanted self-guided driving tours. I think we constantly had to ask ourselves when we got turned down and stuff, or we come home exhausted at midnight after working a full day and doing a big public presentation, what do you want to leave behind when you leave this planet? What do you want to be your contribution? And there was many a time my family would say, oh, you're not going to do another presentation. I'd say yes, because we didn't get paid to do this. We were doing this all on our own, and I had to use all my vacation and sick time to do it. But looking back after 20 years, I would say it was worth it, even though we had so much doubt, so much people doubting us in the beginning. We would say, if we made this happen, it would be an incredible achievement, and it would be so important to the next generation. We need to do it.